Thank you very much to everyone for coming to the talk, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and also for accommodating the last-minute schedule snafu. So I'm going to talk about the intersection of mechanism design and cryptocurrencies, and the works of my own that I'm going to talk about are joint with Miles Karsten, Harry Kolodner, and Arvind Narayanan, another paper with Jonah Brown-Cohen, Arvind, and Alex Somas. And last, if there's time at the end, I'll talk briefly about a paper with Nick Arnasti. Okay, so what I want to talk about in this talk is I'm really only going to focus on the incentives and the economic aspect of designing cryptocurrencies. So I just want to be really clear about what that means. I am going to talk about and what I'm not going to talk about. So what I'm not going to talk about is I'm not going to talk about cryptographic security, and I'm not going to talk about networking security or classical distributed computing or distributed system stuff. And I'm not going to be thinking of attackers who want to break the system. So I'm not going to be considering that. What I do want to consider is I'm going to be considering, just that cryptocurrencies are protocols. And in my language, I would call them mechanisms. And so what happens is, as a cryptocurrency designer, you propose a protocol, and you need to incentivize the users to follow that protocol. Okay, so I'm only going to focus on the incentives aspect. And so here, I would like to say is a representative distinction. So if you know what selfish mining and double spending are, then this will make sense. If you don't know what selfish mining is, I'll give you a little bit more information later in the talk. But what I would say is that selfish mining, I want to think of that as a strategic deviation. So if there is someone in Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency that is doing this selfish mining attack, which again, I'll give a little bit more detail about later, it doesn't directly attack consensus. So the underlying cryptocurrency will still function. It's just that there's going to be one user who is getting more than their fair share of mining rewards. And I want to distinguish that from something like double spending. So double spending, I would say, is a malicious attack. It's directly attacking consensus. So if you have a cryptocurrency where everyone is regularly double spending, that is not a functional cryptocurrency. Whereas you can have a functional cryptocurrency where there is selfish mining, just the incentives will be misaligned, and you may have people deviating from the protocol. It may cause a long-term problem. So I want to make that distinction. Okay, so let me again take one more slide just to give you one more, a little bit more high-level detail of what I want to talk about. So using Bitcoin as an example, let me just quickly go through some ways that you can't deviate from the protocol. So one thing you can't do in the Bitcoin protocol, unless you're going to break digital signatures, you can't forge transactions. So that's not the kind of deviations from the protocol that I'm going to look at. Another thing you can't do, unless you can find hash collisions, you can't retroactively change the contents of a block. Okay, and the main reasons for this is just that even though these are common cryptographic primitives, they're actually quite good at their job, and they prevent certain kinds of deviations. But there are still ways you can deviate from the Bitcoin protocol without breaking any cryptography. So for example, the Bitcoin protocol says you should point to the longest chain. You don't have to do that. There's no cryptography that ensures that you do that. You're maybe incentivized to do that, because if you don't point to the longest chain, your block may never get in the longest chain, and then you just kind of wasted your time. But the cryptography is not what's forcing you to do that. Another thing you can do when you create a block, you can hide it. You don't have to broadcast it immediately. And another thing you can do, maybe the Bitcoin protocol would like you to include the highest fee per block space transactions that are in the mempool, but you don't have to do that either. You can include any set of transactions you want. And the main idea behind these is that these are not cryptographic challenges, right? So you are not going to design fancier digital signatures or fancier hash pointers that are somehow going to force you to broadcast the block immediately when you find it. Instead, the solution to these problems is you just want to incentivize users to follow the protocol. Okay, And the last thing that I want to note, which is just reiterating a point from before, again, I'm not going to consider these kind of like network partitioning attacks or eclipse attacks or things like this, which I imagine you've seen in many of the previous talks at this conference. And again, that's because my goal is I really want to focus only on the strategic aspect. And I want to be as insightful and as transparent and as tractable in studying this. But that does mean that I'm not going to be able to study other aspects that other works look at. Okay. So the main goal of this talk is I'm really just kind of advocating more for this research agenda. And what I want to do is I want to overview kind of like what's out there. Why do I think this agenda is cool? And then I am going to focus on my own work for the second half of the talk. And again, this is going to be focused on the design of cryptocurrencies and very specifically on how do you design a cryptocurrency that incentivizes users to follow the protocol. Okay. And sorry, and then the last thing I want to point out is I am going to cover several different topics. And so there's going to be some context switching. I will pause, for 30 seconds or so at each context switch to give you a little bit of time to reset. And those will also be good times. If there's a mechanism to get questions to me, that's a good time to ask questions. If not, I'll just take questions at the end. Okay, so this is just a brief outline of what I'm going to cover. The first two topics is previous work by other authors. And I'm going to go over that first, and that will kind of give you one sample topic for how to reason about this. And then the last three topics I would say are kind of extensions of this work into more advanced settings. And that's a little bit more recent, and that's work that I did myself. Okay, so now I'm going to get started. And the first thing I have to do is, so I said I want to talk about game theory or mechanism design. So the first thing I need to do is I need to formally specify what is the game that the participants are playing. And just to be clear, the games that I have in mind, the miners are the players. And the reward that they're shooting for, they're trying to get Bitcoin in reward. Okay, so what's the game? So in the game, there's just a set of miners, and every miner has some fraction of the total mining power. I've used X to denote that. And at all times, every miner is aware of some directed tree. So think of this as for every block, that's a node. It points to a previous block, which is what it was mined on top of. And they all share this genesis block, which is the common root. Okay, so that's the setup. Now what's the game? So initially there's just the genesis block. And then at every time step, so in this model, the time steps are discrete. There's a random miner who's selected to mine a block. They're selected proportional to their fraction of mining power. And what do? They create a node, and they can add a directed edge to any node that they have heard of. Okay, so they can point anywhere. So this is the idea that the Bitcoin protocol might ask you to point to the longest chain that you've heard of, but you don't have to. You can point anywhere. Okay, and at every time step, the miners can also broadcast the nodes that they've heard of. And what does this do? This just adds that node to nodes that every other miner has heard. Okay, so again, what I want to point out is that there is no cryptography that forces you to mine on top of the longest chain. But of course, you do have to mine on top of a block that you've heard of. You can't mine on top of a block that you haven't heard of yet. Okay, so that's the game. I've defined the actions that the players can take. And now I need to define the payoffs. So the payoff is going to be the following. So as the number of time steps approach infinity, the payoff is going to be equal to the fraction of blocks in the longest chain created by you. Okay, so what I want to do now, I'm going to go on to the next slide and keep all of this detail. And I'm going to discuss some aspects of this game in a little bit more. Okay, so I decided in this model that we wanted the time steps to be discrete. So we just said there's time step 1, there's a miner who mines. There's time step 2, there's a miner who mines, and so on. And we all know that that's actually not how Bitcoin works. Bitcoin does not say in the 10-minute mark, there's one miner who mines. And then at the 20-minute mark, there's another miner who mines. It doesn't work like that, right? We know that really what happens, there's this Poisson process, and every time it ticks, there's a new block that's created. So this abstracts that away. And I'll discuss on the next slide kind of what I think about that. But it's worth noting that this is a distinction between this model and what happens in reality. I also really simplified broadcasting, right? So I said there's only one kind of broadcasting. If you broadcast something, everyone hears it, and they hear it immediately. So this abstracts away the fact that really communication is point to point, and really when we try to communicate, there's some latency. So both of those are not in the model. And again, on the next slide, I'll say kind of like what I think about that. And the other thing that I want to point out is that this assumption that the payoff is the fraction of blocks in the longest chain. So I would say this is assuming that the players are trying to maximize their Bitcoin per unit time. And it also assumes that the players are paid exclusively according to a block reward. So this model is assuming that the transaction fees are 0 and that every block is worth the same amount. And it's also assuming that the players want to maximize their Bitcoin per unit time. So let me very quickly say why maximizing the fraction of blocks in the longest chain is maximizing your Bitcoin per unit time. And the reason for that is because Bitcoin has this difficulty adjustment. And due to the difficulty adjustment, the longest chain of Bitcoin grows at 2016 blocks per week. And so as a result, that means that the number of blocks in the longest chain are really normalized with unit time. So the fraction of blocks you have in the longest chain is implicitly or explicitly normalized by unit time. Okay. So let me discuss each of these assumptions a little bit now. So I mentioned that this model abstracts away the fact that it takes an exponential process to find blocks. It's not discrete. And this definitely makes the model in math more transparent. It makes it simpler. And superficially, it's less realistic just because we know that that's not how Bitcoin works. But what I want to say is that I really don't think this affects the qualitative conclusions. It definitely makes the math different. I agree with that. But I don't think it's the case that because selfish mining is profitable in this model, if you were to put back in, exponential time, maybe the numerics would change slightly, but it's not going to change the fact that selfish mining is profitable or not profitable. I also noted that it abstracts away point-to-point communication and latency. And like I was saying before, if you're trying to analyze network security, this is really important. But it turns out, I would say that if you're trying to analyze incentives, that I don't think point-to-point communication and latency, they're not crucial for understanding this specific kind of incentives. And this makes the model in math drastically more transparent and, again, superficially less realistic. But again, I really want to say I really believe this, that yes, the precise numerics would change. And yes, maybe some later researchers will show that actually there's a very interesting interaction between latency and selfish mining that we haven't discovered yet. But for now, I'm not aware of any qualitative interaction between latency or point-to-point communication and things and strategic deviations like selfish mining. So yes, the numbers would change, but it's not going to change profitable versus not profitable. But on the other hand, it makes everything much more insightful and easier to understand. Okay, now the third assumption I want to say is different than the first two. So the third assumption is, I said, I'm assuming that the players are trying to maximize their Bitcoin per unit time, and it assumes that they're paid exclusively through a block reward. So this is different. And I want to say this, for example, assumes that the exchange rate of a currency like the US dollar or any other currency to Bitcoin is what economists would call exogenous. So what I mean by that is that the exchange rate is fixed and you really want to maximize your Bitcoin per unit time. So for example, in practice, what might happen is maybe if I try to selfish mine on Bitcoin, maybe that would hurt the exchange rate of Bitcoin because people would lose confidence in it. And so maybe I make more Bitcoin, but I make less real currency. So that is actually not captured by this model. And another thing, it assumes that the block reward dominates transaction fees. So for the way that Bitcoin is right now, or certainly the way it was 4 or 8 years ago, currently the transaction fees are not a substantial fraction of the rewards. Most of the rewards that miners get are block rewards, and it's pretty dominant. I think currently it's like 85% or something of the rewards come from the block reward. And longer ago, it was higher than that. And so sure, approximating 15% with 0 does mean that numerically things would be different, but it doesn't mean that like fundamentally things would be different. But it is definitely assuming that 15% versus 90% of the rewards are coming from transaction fees. And so my take on this, which hopefully I can quickly convince you of too, is that I think results under these assumptions are valuable, and I think that they give really good insight into one aspect, which is, what will incentives of Bitcoin look like while the exchange rate is not changing based on selfish mining, and while people are rewarded mostly through block rewards instead of transaction fees. I also believe that this should not be the only research that's ever done in this direction, and that future work should also examine these aspects separately. So I'm going to talk about one of my own works that looks at transaction fees. I think people should also look at when the exchange rate is affected by selfish mining. And I believe that, and I think that's why we have follow-up work. Okay, so that's everything that I was going to say about the model. So hopefully that gave you some insight into the theme of how I like this research area that proposes models and studies. Is again, I like looking at simple games that will give you good, tractable insight. Okay, so as a first sanity check to help understand the protocol, let's look through what is the Nakamoto consensus or the longest chain protocol in this language. So what that would suggest is when you are selected to build a block, you should look at the nodes that you've heard about. You should look at whichever one is furthest from the root, and that's where you should point. And if there are any ties, you should break ties in favor of the node that you heard about first. And in this model, it is possible that there are still ties just because the time steps are discrete. So after that, maybe let's just say you tie break randomly. In the second part of the protocol, remember we said the other action you take is you can broadcast, and the longest chain protocol would say you should broadcast always. You should never hide your blocks. Okay, so let me try to rephrase. Now, obviously, in Nakamoto's original white paper, he didn't, state or prove any formal theorems in this language. But I think the intuition he provided, if you were going to try to port it into this stylized model, would sound something like this. So it'd say like, well, if all the other miners follow the longest chain protocol, as defined above, and you have less than 50% of the computational power in the network, then your best response in this game is also to follow the longest chain protocol. Okay, this intuition was around, for several years after the white paper too. And so why was this the intuition? Well, we know that you only get rewards if your blocks are included in the longest chain. And what Nakamoto considered was one very specific kind of deviation. So he didn't consider all deviations, but he considered one kind of deviation. And one kind of deviation is you could try to build your own separate chain. So you could just say, ignore the rest of the network, I'm going to build my own chain. And he does a correct random walk analysis. And what he shows is that if you have less than 50% of the computational power and you try to build your own chain, then you're never going to be the longest chain. Everyone else is going to eventually take you over. Okay, so this particular deviation is not good. And that was kind of the intuition that people had for a while, that because this particular deviation was not good, that you couldn't do anything clever with less than 50% of the power. Okay, and then if you're familiar with selfish mining, this was a huge result in 2014. This was actually the kind of result that got me interested in cryptocurrencies at the time, because it fits along this theme of understanding how to incentivize players to follow a protocol. And what they showed is that actually, if you have more than 1/3, then following the longest chain protocol is actually not a best response to all others following the longest chain. There is something better you can do. Okay. And I'm not going to give you the technical details. I'm not going to give you the calculations, but I just do need to give you a little bit of intuition for what this attack is in case you haven't seen it before. So the main idea here, it's what's called a block withholding attack. When you create a block, you hide it. Okay. Now, why could that possibly help you? Well, if you are lucky and you create 2 blocks in a row, so I create a block and then I hide it, and then I get lucky and I also create a block in the next timestamp. So now I'm in very good shape, right? So I have my 2 blocks over here and no one else knows about them. And the rest of the network is 2 blocks behind me. So now I am guaranteed that all of the work that the network does until they catch up within one of me, all of that work is going to be wasted. And that's good for me because if they're wasting effort, then I have a larger fraction of the blocks in the longest chain, which is my objective function. Okay, so that's if I get lucky. Now I might get unlucky because maybe I mine a block and I hide it, and then someone else mines a block and then they publish it. And now these 2 blocks are competing and I might lose. And if I lose this block, then that's revenue that I would have had otherwise by being honest. So the part I'm skipping is trying to calculate what's the expected profit as a function of my mining power and what's the expected loss as a function of my mining power. And it turns out that when you have at least 1/3 of the computational power, that your expected gain is bigger than your expected loss. Okay, so I'm skipping the calculations, but I just wanted to give you intuition for how could this possibly be profitable, but no intuition for the calculations. Okay, but the other result that I want to mention, which is I think much less well known than selfish mining, is that in this same model, there's a theorem that says if you have less than 30% of the mining power, then longest chain actually is a best response to all other miners using longest chain. So it's a Nash equilibrium for everyone to use longest chain, as long as no one is too big. Okay, so what I would say is the takeaway from this is that in the Bitcoin model, so when there's proof of work, there's block rewards and no transaction fees, large miners, they don't have to be 50% miners, but large miners, more than 30%, can increase their rewards, but small miners can't. Okay, so it does mean that you need to be mindful of having large miners, but if you don't have large miners, then there's just nothing profitable they can do to deviate. Okay, so let me now try to say, okay, so why is this relevant for reality? So my understanding is that selfish mining has never been detected on Bitcoin. I've heard mixed stories about whether or not it's been detected on altcoins or not. I'm not claiming that it has, and I don't know that it has or that it hasn't. Now, what I would say that the goal of this research is not to predict the downfall of any cryptocurrency that's vulnerable to selfish mining. So that's not actually what I predict will happen. But I do think it's important to understand why. And I think that this line of research helps understand that. So for example, you'd say maybe the reason that selfish mining has not been detected on Bitcoin is because there's never been a 30% miner. So actually, I don't think that's true for Bitcoin. But if it were true, then it would make me ask questions like, well, wait, what would happen if there's a 35% miner in the future? Does that mean that they might selfish mine on Bitcoin? And how do we make sure that that never happens? The more, the explanation that convinces me more is that maybe this assumption I made that miners are just trying to maximize the Bitcoin that they earn, maybe that's missing something from reality, because maybe the exchange rate between Bitcoin and real currency is actually what economists would call endogenous. So maybe it's the case that if I tried to selfish mine on Bitcoin, maybe that would hurt the value of the currency because other people would lose confidence and they would invest less. Okay, and so maybe I would increase the total Bitcoin that I make, but it would just, it would give me less actual utility because I could trade it for less real currency. Okay, and so that would still make me ask questions if we uncovered that that was the main reason. Then I would still ask, well, what if there was a large miner? So what if you had a 35% miner and that miner could launch a very large short sale of Bitcoin? So what if they could bet against the exchange rate? So currently, my understanding, just so I'm not an expert in finance, but based on the people I've talked to, is that currently it is not possible to launch a massive short sale of Bitcoin. That there's just not a financial market that will let you do that. But I don't know whether that will stay the case forever. And so it would, make me question sort of like, okay, well, what if in the future it is possible to do a massive short sale of Bitcoin? Would that mean that now we should be nervous about selfish mining, or is there something else going on? So basically, the main thing I want to say is that these kinds of results, I do think, are the right way to address questions like this. It's not the right way to predict exactly what's going to happen in practice, but that's not the goal of this research. It's to identify kind of like, what are the things you should be thinking about as a designer, maybe a little bit more qualitatively than than caring about the precise numbers. Okay, so again, the takeaway I would say is I'm not predicting that selfish mining is going to happen soon or anything like that. But I would still say just because selfish mining is not happening right now, I would not say, if you're designing a cryptocurrency that you want to last for another 25 years, don't assume that it never will happen just because it's not happening now, and try to understand what are the factors that might cause selfish mining to be more or less profitable, and understand why it's not happening now and how you can maintain that state. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the introduction. And I want to get into now, I'm going to talk about some more advanced directions that are follow-ups to this. And like I said, in this case, there's going to be a little bit of context switching. So if there are questions from the audience now would be a reasonable time. And if there are no questions, I'll just pause for another couple of seconds before getting into the next portion of the talk.
We can go on.
Cool. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between the block reward and transaction fees. So currently, transaction fees, like I mentioned, in Bitcoin are very low. So I did a quick check before giving this talk. It's about 15% of the reward that miners get seems to be coming from transaction fees. And so all the previous analysis prior to this work I'll tell you about assumes that the transaction fees are zero, and that's not an unreasonable approximation, especially for when these papers were first written and the transaction fees accounted for even less. But as you guys know, every 4 years, the block reward halves. Eventually, it's going to be zero. And when this happens, transaction fees are expected to take over. So what that means is that while previously variance in transaction fees between blocks just meant, very little because it just wasn't, it was changing maybe by 5% the amount of reward you got. Now it would be a big deal if the transaction fees changed wildly from block to block. Okay, and so there's this hotly debated block size debate. This was one of the motivating factors for Bitcoin Cash splitting from Bitcoin. And so this is hotly debated. How do you make sure that the transaction fees rise and are stable? So that, for example, the transaction fees are large enough to replace the block reward. At the same time, though, what was previously not a hotly debated topic was whether it mattered that you were getting 6.25 Bitcoin in expectation versus 6.25 Bitcoin deterministically via the block reward. So for example, I think a lot of people would have said, well, my intuition is that if the miners are risk neutral, then they don't really care whether they get 6.25 in expectation or 6.25 deterministically. And the first work I want to tell you about, and you have transaction fees instead of block reward, then things can get significantly more complicated with incentives. Let me just focus on the theorem is that there is a selfish mining variant that is profitable no matter your computational power. So if you have 1% of the total computational power, then there is a selfish mining-like attack that you can do to get like 1.1% or 1.05 or 1.05% or something of the total rewards. Okay. Another thing that might happen, I'll go through this in a second just to give intuition. And let me pause. There's a quick question that just came up in the chat, which is what do these phrases endogenous and exogenous mean? So that's those are terms that economists use. So exogenous means that something is kind of fixed outside the model and does not change depending on what you do. So that would mean the exchange rate for US dollars to Bitcoin. If someone selfish mines or someone double spends, it doesn't affect the exchange rate. And endogenous would mean that the opposite. So that would mean that if someone selfish mines, that may cause the exchange rate to lower, or if someone double spends, that may cause the exchange rate to get lower. And so the analysis that I was doing and that I'm doing now is all assuming that it is exogenous. So that means that you really want to maximize the number of Bitcoin you get, and you're not concerned about affecting the exchange rate by getting more Bitcoin. Okay, so all right. So let me see. So I think in the interest of time, let me just kind of put this on the slide. I'm not going to read through it. So I will just assert that there is a formal mining game. I'm not going to go through it. It's actually not crucial to understand all of these details, to understand the intuition and what comes next. But I do just want to clarify that with more time, I could present this slide. There is a rigorous game that backs up these results. Okay, so let me now give you the intuition, which again, you can get the intuition without understanding the formal model. So the longest chain protocol with transaction fees would sound like this. Whenever you build a block, point to the furthest node. Whenever you break ties in favor of the first you heard about. You should do uniformly at random after that. And you should include the maximum available fees that are in the mempool that haven't been included in a previous block. Okay, so let's go through a quick example. So here, let's say that there are 3 blocks that you have heard about. Let's say you heard about this block in state A first. Okay, so what would longest chain do? Longest chain would say, well, there's 5 remaining transactions in the mempool that have not been included in the chain A, and that's the chain you heard about first. You should point on top of that, and you should make a block that has 5. So that's following the longest chain protocol. Let me define a really, really mild deviation. So the only thing that's going to be different is instead of tie breaking in favor of what you heard about first, we're just going to tie break in favor of what's going to let you create the biggest block. Okay, so what that would say is you'd say like, well, there's fewer transactions included in chain B. And so if I mine on top of that block, I can actually include more fees and I'll get more revenue for doing so. So this is not really, right? This is not really affecting, you're still doing longest chain, right? If there's no ties, they're even exactly the same strategy. And it initially seems like maybe this isn't a big deal. And what I want to highlight is if you know that the other miners are using this petty tie-breaking rule, then there actually is something even more deviant that you can do. So here, let's say that now there is a unique longest chain, right? There's just the 7 block and the 15 block. And then what you're supposed to do, if you mine on the longest chain, even with petty tie-breaking, you're supposed to mine on top of the 15, and you're supposed to get payoff of 5. Now, here's something else you could do. You could be the reason that there was this conflicting block in the first place, right? So you could make a block on top of the 7 that has 10 transaction fees in it. And now if the next miner is petty tie breaking, then you are actually going to become the new longest chain. Okay, so again, I'm not claiming that everyone is going to petty tie break. I'm not claiming that, you know, there's going to be a disaster. At the same time, you know, petty tie breaking is myopically strictly better than the random tie breaking or the first heard about tie breaking. So it's not crazy to think that. But it is true that you do need to think about what the other players are going to do in order to realize whether it's profitable to do this deviation or not. Okay, the last thing I want to do before moving on from transaction fees is I just want to give you intuition for why is selfish mining better. Okay, so here's where, again, I need to give the main intuition. The main intuition is that when you selfish mine, you create a block and you hide it. Okay, and we said this can be good if you find the next block. This can be bad if you don't find the next block. And the risk is you might lose this block. Okay, so the new idea that you couldn't do with the block reward is you only hide blocks that have very low fees. So for instance, what might happen is it could be that you're following the longest chain, everything's good, and then someone creates a new block and they include all the available fees. And then just by dumb luck, 30 seconds later, instead of 10 minutes later, you create a block and there just haven't been that many fees that arrived for you to include. So for this block, you kind of may as well hide it and try to selfish mine. Even if you're really unlikely to succeed and you lose, this doesn't really matter because the value of that block is small. So the expected loss, even if you lose it, is small. Okay, so what that means is that basically no matter how small your computational power is, there is some sufficiently small block that it's worth just hiding it. And there's always some probability that you wind up getting unlucky with a really small block. And in that case, you should hide it. You'll do strictly better than being honest. Okay, so the takeaway from this section is I just want to say, just because a protocol appears as incentive compatible with block reward, and there are even theorems supporting this, don't assume that that's necessarily going to stay the same way with transaction fees, because things like this can happen even when the miners are risk neutral. Okay. So since I am almost out of time, I'm just going to try and give some high-level intuition for what makes proof of stake from an incentives perspective, what makes it different from proof of work, and then I'll end the talk after that. Okay, so this is just a slide kind of showing that Bitcoin consumes a lot of energy. Probably you guys already know that, so I won't pause here for too long. And this is one of the main motivating factors for proof of stake. It's not the only motivating factor, but it's one very compelling one. And the idea here, so I know that you heard about Algorand in earlier talks, so you've heard of some kinds of proof of stake protocols. And the idea is basically, you still can't freely duplicate currency, so this is a reasonable way to be symbol proof. Okay, so the kinds of protocols I'm going to talk about are actually different than Algorand. They're not based on Byzantine consensus. But one thing you might try to do is you might try to say, you know what, I love Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is super cool. I want to just try and replace proof of work with proof of stake, but stick with Nakamoto-style consensus. And here's just one sample approach of what that might look like. You might say, the main idea behind Bitcoin is you need to hash some stuff and have that be very small, and that's what makes a valid block. And for proof of work, this stuff is the contents of the block and this nonce and other things. And for proof of stake, one thing you can do, this is not a good idea, by the way, this is just a toy proposal. You can just say, well, you should have a coin and you should own that coin. And the hash of the ID of that coin and the current timestamp should be small. So what makes this proof of stake? Well, now it doesn't matter how much computational power you have, because you only need to hash one coin per time, or per coin per timestamp, one hash. If you have more power, it just doesn't help. Like the more hashes you do, it's not going to help you. But more coins, that will give you a larger chance of having one that's successful. Okay. So the main challenge here is you need a source of pseudo-randomness. And the main thing I want to highlight is that proof of work, as long as H is a good hash function, is a really nice source of pseudo-randomness. And the reason is that the next miner is unpredictable. No matter I'm selfish mining, no matter if I'm honest mining, I never know who the next miner is going to be. It's always independent and random proportional to hash power. And the point is, it's just really challenging to replicate this in proof of stake if you want to use the blockchain itself as a source of pseudo-randomness. So for example, in this naive proposal, one thing I can do is I can pre-compute all coin timestamp pairs where I would be eligible to mine if I own that coin. And now I know a lot more about the future. And that maybe will give me more power. Okay. So what I want to do, let me skip this. So this is just, again, this slide is just saying There are formal definitions which say, what do I mean by longest chain proof of stake? This is what I mean, but I'm not gonna pause here. I'm just gonna give you intuition for how can you do better with selfish mining. Okay, so here's how you can do better. So again, take as this example where you can pre-compute all of the time steps where you own a coin where you are gonna mine. Now, when you think about withholding a block, what you should do is you should say, you know what? Let me look at the next time step that I'm gonna create a block after this. And if that is very soon, then maybe you should withhold this block because you're much more likely to enter the good case than the bad case. If that is a long time from now, then maybe you should not withhold this block because you're more likely to lose. And so basically, there's some math and some theorems behind this, but basically what we point out is that no matter how small your hash power is or your stake is, there is always some sufficiently amount of lucky you can get. And the point is, if the randomness is predictable in the future, then you will know when you are getting lucky. And you can only hide the blocks when you are going to succeed in the future. Okay, so what that means is that you can always do some kind of selfish mining. All right, so last thing I want to point out is that these ideas are maybe related to things you can do on Byzantine consensus protocols, but again, all of this theory is really specialized to longest chain proof of stake protocols. Okay, so let me now just kind of jump to the end. I'll skip this last part. So I'm skipping kind of slow. And all right, so here's the conclusion. So takeaway one, when you're designing a cryptocurrency, the incentives matter. My opinion is that incentives are best analyzed in simple tractable models where you can isolate one key aspect. So I am not saying you should never do distributed systems research on cryptocurrencies. Of course you should do that. You should also do that. But I would argue that I think we should be doing them in different models. I think it is much easier to understand incentives when the model is simple. And if the model is simple, I think that's really bad for distributed systems because you don't learn what you need to learn, right? So we just need different models to answer those questions. The second takeaway that I want to point out is that selfish mining was a really useful lens to analyze longest chain variance. Not because I'm necessarily claiming that selfish mining is the attack that's going to happen in practice. I'm not claiming that. But just because it did still give us insight as to whether large but not 50% miners could do something profitable, or small miners could do something profitable. And I think that was a helpful distinction, independent of whether it was selfish mining that caused that. Okay. And then the last recap is that I showed you two follow-up settings where transaction fees, the incentives are harder than block rewards, and proof of stake is harder than proof of work. It doesn't mean we should give up on those settings. It just means that we need to understand that they are not proof of work and that they require additional thought. So that's it. I'll end the talk there. Sorry I ran a little bit over, but that's it. And if there are any questions, then I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks, Matt. Great result. This is very interesting models. I have some questions on this. I meant to ask you, when you talk about the best response, the solution concept is Nash equilibrium, right? Has anybody tried to study the sequential game in terms of subgame perfect equilibrium or other concepts?
Good question. I need to think before giving a clear answer. I think, so it is possible that the kind of analysis that is done, it may be that it is already subgame perfect, the equilibria that, so it could be that the result where I said that it is a Nash equilibrium for everyone to be honest in the Bitcoin protocol, it could be that that equilibrium is also subgame perfect. and maybe the proof establishes that, but I don't know that for sure, and I do not know of work that has explicitly made this distinction. But I'm definitely careful not to say that work has not done that, just because there's so much cryptocurrency work, and I think I don't know a lot of it. But I think from the EC style research, I am not aware of papers that have explicitly made that distinction.
For SP to hold, the analysis definitely need to discuss where basically off the Nash equilibrium path, some other users are not following the longest chain rule either. And then to show some best response exists.
Yeah, so you're describing sort of like, is it possible to get a weird, right, sorry. So just to be clear, I think these works are not claiming that this is the unique Nash equilibrium. They are just claiming that it is one Nash equilibrium. So there could be other Nash equilibria like you're describing, where there's really bizarre off equilibrium play. Right, so it's definitely possible that there are other Nash equilibria, but these works are specifically interested in just understanding, is longest chain a Nash equilibrium or not? Is longest chain subgame perfect or not? And my instinct, again, I haven't verified this and I don't know whether it's written in the papers. My instinct is that there probably are bizarre non-subgame perfect Nash equilibria that are not longest chain, but also that longest chain, when it's a Nash equilibrium, I would guess that it is also subgame perfect. But again, I don't know that there are theorems written that say this.
Okay. A question from the audience is, have you considered the composability of incentive mechanism in blockchain? Pretty interesting question.
Let me try to think for a second about what that means. I don't know if it's possible to clarify. I can answer what I think the question is asking, which is, say that I have an incentive scheme that is good, and I have another incentive scheme that is good, and then I want to compose them together to do something else. Would I immediately know whether that incentive scheme is going to be good or not? I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that question. What I would say, though, is that I think that is at least for the style of research I'm advocating for, personally, I think that is a good way to think about it. Because like I said, I'm not myself, I'm not coding up a cryptocurrency, right? So that's not my technical ability. And so I think that what would be useful for our research, this research community that I'm advocating for, is to produce kind of like very modular components. And modular components are best if they're composable. So I would say, I think that's a good way to look at the problem. Can you design little modular components that can be composed together without losing their properties? So I hope that I interpreted the question correctly, but I haven't thought about it, but I think that is a good way to think in this direction.
Okay, I have a question of my own. Definitely when transaction fees are getting bigger and bigger compared with the block rewards, the game gets more complicated. What is the arrival model that people use for how much transaction fees are included in those transactions?
Yeah, so let me, I can at least show you, I can just pull up the slide that I skipped, which has the model that we used. So I'll leave it up here while I'm talking. So our goal in this paper was to pick the simplest arrival model possible. So we basically assumed that the fees arrive continuously and that they were non-atomic. And the reason that we did that is because we kind of said that is probably the best case scenario. That if you're trying to design an incentive compatible cryptocurrency with transaction fees, that is probably the best thing you would hope for. Like if you got to design the transaction fees, you got to tell people how to arrive, that's probably the simplest thing you could hope for. But our results were more kind of like negative results in the sense that we showed that even in this model, selfish mining is really profitable. Even in this model, there's like other bizarre things that can happen. So there's another, again, I know that there's lots of works, but the one that I'm most familiar with is, oh man, I forget all three authors. It's a paper by economists. So I remember I know that Jacob Leshno is one of the authors because I'm friends with him and I know him better, but he has two co-authors who I'm blanking on the names. But they had a queuing theory model that they used that was much more sophisticated than this. And that now allows transactions to arrive and they can be discrete and they can arrive at discrete times. And they studied things that were very different than what we studied. But that I thought was an elegant model to study using queuing theory. I suspect that there are other models that people have used too, but that's the other one that I've seen that I found being kind of elegant, just because queuing theory has a lot of deep theory that makes analysis trackable.
Nice, thanks. Maybe one last question. At the end, you mentioned that in the version of the proof-of-stake protocol you formalized, pre-compute would lead to selfish mining. I think there are other forms of proof-of-stake similar to the one you modeled. The one you modeled, you put a timestamp in the input of the hash. There are other versions where the hash format does not change much, but the threshold they compare against may depend on the time.
Right. So I think the way I would phrase it is if it's the case, so I don't know if this is exactly what you were getting at. So there are some proof of stake proposals that use threshold signatures. And for threshold signatures, that is something different. And the way I would kind of, let me see if I can, I don't think I'm going to be able to get into full details, but what I would say is that the question is just, is it the case that you as a miner who is trying to create a block on top of another one, is it computationally efficient or not computationally efficient for you to figure out the next block you can make? And if the answer to that is yes, then you can do some kind of predictable selfish mining. And if the answer to that is no, then you can't. So I would say if you're using something like threshold signatures to enter the hash or to do something like this, then without the other people who need to be part of the threshold signature, I just can't do anything. And so I would say that kind of protocol falls outside our model. If you use digital signatures, that doesn't. If you use, like the block you're pointing to, that doesn't. The only question is, if I know the block I want to mine on top of, can I find the next timestamp where I can create a block? And if the answer is yes, then I can learn whether that is sooner in the future than normal or not, and that may give me an advantage. So that's the main thing that drives it. And so sort of like there are more proof of stake protocols than you would imagine that sort of like the answer to that question is yes, even though the protocol looks very complicated. So that was kind of like the main reason we wanted to write this paper, was to say like, that's the main question you want to ask is, can you on your own computationally efficiently figure out the next time you can produce a block on top of some block B? But it is true, threshold signatures are one good way to get around this problem if they're used correctly.
Okay, I see. That's interesting. Well, I think because of the time, we're definitely out of time. We'll finish here, and thanks, Matt, again.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks again to the organizers for having me.